You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I defined those culinary artists who work on behalf of their enslaved sisters and brothers as culinary activists. They were actually working on behalf of all Africans, and many of them were involved directly or indirectly in the Underground Railroad. Sometimes their homes or businesses were local headquarters. A few even hired enslaved runaways to work at their places of business. Others collected money, clothing, and food for a specific drop-off place connected with the Underground Railroad. And those places were sometimes an eating establishment.
Hello, and welcome to episode 404 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Did you know that many of the food traditions that we define as distinctly American cuisine today have roots in African culinary traditions and history? Diane Spivey, a culinary historian and author of 3 culinary history books, joins us to help us uncover the rich and complex legacy of African and African-American foodways and how those foodways have helped establish the United States. Now, during our conversation, Diane reveals how African and African-American cooking made European colonial success possible, the ways African Americans contributed to and supported the Continental Army and American success in the American Revolution, and how African American chefs, bakers, and cooks worked as culinary activists during the anti-slavery and abolition movements. But first, I've been experimenting with a new type of newsletter for you. It's called History Behind the Headlines. This is a brief weekly newsletter that comes out on Fridays that offers you insight into the history and historical origins of topics that are appearing in our present-day news. For example, in our very first experiment, we talked about birthright citizens. And we did this by looking back at what some of our guest historians have had to say in previous episodes. Now, to receive the History Behind the Headlines newsletter, plus the show notes for new episodes in your inbox, visit benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. And if you really like it or you have suggestions about it, just hit reply to the newsletter and let me know, because it's still a work in progress and I really want to make this information useful for you. So Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. All right, I hope you've eaten recently, because this is an episode that is going to make you hungry. At least it made me hungry. Anyway, let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a culinary historian who has devoted more than 40 years to studying and recording African-American food traditions and cooking. Her research has led her to write many articles and 2 books: The Peppers, Cracklings, and Knots of Wool Cookbook, The Global Migration of African Cuisine, and At the Table of Power, Food and Cuisine in the African-American Struggle for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Diane Spivey.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, Diane, I loved reading At the Table of Power. You seem very knowledgeable about food and the different people who have prepared it over the years. I'm curious what drew you to your study of African-American food traditions and cooking throughout American and United States history.
First of all, I consider myself a student. I tell this to my son all the time. He appreciates my cooking, but I tell him I'm still a student. I'm still learning, and I always will be. But I tell you, back in 1971, I got married and I wanted to prepare some delicious meals for my husband. So I started taking out cookbooks from the library, and I purchased and borrowed cookbooks on African, Mexican, and African American cooking. But it became somewhat sickening, actually, because there was a consistent theme running through volumes on African cuisine. And one of those things was no food products were indigenous to Africa, thereby precluding Africans from being capable of developing any sort of cuisine prior to European invasion. And Africans came into contact with 99% of the foods they consumed only as a result of the slave trade. And also, African culinary traditions vary from country to country and have absolutely nothing in common. Now, according to these same so-called experts. Mexico and South America, too, were primitive in their culinary environments until Europe descended upon them. And it's noticeable that the cuisines showcased for all of these areas celebrate what is considered the European influence. Now, 1971 to 1973 or 75 is still the 1960s era, the era that has been going through a cultural awakening that for African Americans dug just as deep or a little deeper than the Harlem Renaissance. And at the time, I was reading African history scholars such as John Henry Clark, Yosef Ben Jochannan, Dr. Ben, Leo Weiner, Sheikh Anta Diop, Basil Davidson, Frantz Fanon, Chancellor Williams, Franz Boas, J.C. de Graaf Johnson, and others. And their works contain much of the core knowledge on African history. And yet, here were 20th century cookbooks that claimed that Africa never had indigenous food products, except for a couple of beans and some sort of millet, nor a cuisine. And we know, of course, that these books were simply trying to reiterate what we call the Bwana and Tarzan movies and books by saying, well, Africans just ate each other. So I began to read and study other cookbooks on various peoples of color throughout the world. And what I found was numerous commonalities in ingredients and cooking methods of food preparations, unmistakable African imprints shared between Africa and other so-called third world peoples. Noticeably, cookbook authors always failed to acknowledge any African connection to any other cuisine. There was not one contribution from African kitchens to those of any other country on the planet. It was a personal affront and, frankly, a call to intellectual arms. So I found myself at war, you might say, to get the record straight about the African contribution to the world of food and cooking.
It sounds like it must have been a shock to read that Africans did not originate any of the food anywhere in the world, because science, anthropology, geology, and many other fields have all shown that most of human existence and humans came from Africa. So surely there was original food there.
Well, of course, it's the cradle of humankind and also the cradle of culinary achievements, too.
Well, I'm really excited to dive into those achievements. Now, at the outset of your book, At the Table of Power, you note that in the mid to late 19th century, cooking was really seen as the work for people living and working in the lower ranks of society. Would you tell us why that was and what shifted so that today we live in a world where chefs are not only acknowledged, but placed on TV and exalted for their skill, creativity, and flavors in the kitchen?
Cooking in the earlier part of the 20th century and going all the way back to earlier centuries was labor intensive. And to me, and I'm certain to others as well, it still is when you make most things from scratch. But back then, there were no food processors and no pressure cookers. Everything was made from scratch, from the fields and or the garden and the barn on up. And there was massive work involved. Whether the cooking was done at home or commercially, it was considered menial labor. And whites never wanted to have to do this type of labor, never wanted to be branded as menial laborers. But in 1976, the Department of Labor reclassified chefs as professionals. And the foremost criteria for anyone to be recognized as worthy of becoming a chef, that is, if you really want to be taken seriously, you have to attend a cooking school. And in this country and all of Europe, the foundation of your learning experience was and still is to adopt French cuisine and technique. I think that the reclassification was an attempt to follow in the footsteps of the French and how they classify their chefs. Now that there are all of these cooking shows with so-called master chefs and cooking gurus, the culinary arena has evolved into an arm of the entertainment industry. Chefs deemed professionals are now, if you look at a few of the definitions for professional, expert, skillful, masterly, qualified. So, no, cooking is no longer seen as grunt work for Blacks and the bottom rung of society. With Cuisinart and KitchenAid labor saving devices available, everyone wants it. Whites now want it because not only does it pay well, you can be anointed and catapulted to stardom.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk about French cuisine, because your book, At the Table of Power, was really eye-opening to me when I read your descriptions about French cuisine, because when we think of French cuisine, we think of it as the pinnacle of all cooking. If it's French, then there's a lot of butter, there's a lot of flavor. But your historical definition of French cuisine basically turned my stomach a bit. You made it sound like French cuisine of the early modern period, or the early American period, as we like to call it, wasn't really all that appetizing unless you happen to be an elite person and very wealthy.
In terms of the true culinary legacy of France, these are things that we don't learn in school. People don't talk about this. They prefer to see France and European cuisine as, like you said, the pinnacle. Much literature abounds extolling that inherent superiority of the culinary heritage of the French. But with regard to that heritage, generally speaking, the food that the people were able to acquire was always coarse and often insufficient. Meat appeared on the table rarely. The basic foods were bread, soup, dairy products, and butter. Wheat bread was quite rare, only bread of rye and oats, and that frequently was of poor quality. In the poorest regions, the people ate biscuits and porridge of buckwheat or even of chestnuts or maize. Wheat and even rye served largely to pay the taxes and the farm rent, or were sold for export when this was permitted. Potatoes, which later became a staple food product among the farmers, were grown only in a few particularly fertile regions. In the 17th century, there was great suffering in the rural sections of every part of France. The governor of the area wrote in 1675, and I'm quoting him, "It is a fact, and I assure you that I know whereof I speak, that the great majority of the inhabitants of this province lived during the winter only from acorns and roots, and now they can be seen eating the grass of the fields and the bark of trees." And then after 1685, misery seemed to increase. The peasants live from buckwheat bread, and others who have no buckwheat live from roots of ferns, boiled with flour of barley or oats and salt. And one finds them sleeping on straw. They have no clothing except what they wear, and that is very poor. And then 18th century France seemed to fare no better than the previous century. Famine hit France in the winter of 1709. The Great Drought in 1785 forced farmers to sell a portion of their cattle. There was an enormous increase in food prices. In 1774 and 1789, farmers had to live on turnips, milk, and again, even grass.
Yeah, the French in the early modern period do not seem to have had a good, high-quality diet. But we do know from speaking with other scholars that many indigenous peoples in North America did have varied and high-quality diets. Many of these peoples cultivated corn, beans, and squash, and then mixed those with different game that they were able to hunt. And it seems that in many cases where European colonists came into contact with indigenous peoples, that indigenous peoples really helped them improve their diets. And then in your book, At the Table of Power, we learned that there were many contributions that Africans made to early American diets as well. So would you tell us about how Africans became involved in cooking in North America and how their cooking really contributed to the success of European colonial settlement and really even European colonial survival in North America?
Well, I have to tell you that when I talk about African culinary contribution to North America, I can never start with 1619, which is synonymous with slavery. I have to start with there are at least 3 stages of African culinary contribution to North America and the Americas in general. Most people still believe that Africans have no connection to world history, culinary or otherwise, prior to 1619. So I always say that the first stage begins with Africa being the cradle of humankind and civilization, and its cuisine and culture migrating not only to every part of the African continent, but also, this is the second stage, transplanting its cuisine and culture and making indelible culinary marks through exploration, migration, and trade. Expeditions on various cultures in the Americas, such as the Olmecs and Mayans of Mexico, the Chavin of Peru, the Native American mound builders, the Caribs of St. Vincent, and those marks were made long before the so-called discovery of America. But the third stage was Africans dragged to the Americas as slaves, and the African contribution to the success of European colonial settlement. Europeans who came voluntarily were looking to attain a better life. The importation of Africans as slaves was crucial in the building of these colonies. And two of the most crucial building blocks were food production, or agriculture, and cooking. Africans were knowledgeable and possessed the expertise in agriculture and in the preparation and cooking of numerous agricultural products. Farming in West Africa always took into account, among other things, the ecological setting, indigenous crops, the kinds of tools used, how production is organized and carried out, and how farming communities interact socially and economically with larger agricultural networks. Now, with an understanding of their own ecological settings, West African farmers employed complex land combinations which allowed them to differentiate categories of farming. The Yoruba and Beni and other Nigerian societies lived in settled communities on the same sites for several hundred years and evolved agricultural systems that allow continuous cultivation of their soils without loss of fertility. And I mention this expertise because this contributed tremendously to filling the larders of the colonists, where there was an abundance of shellfish and different types of fish, which were net caught. African techniques were used. Seafood was turned into soups, stews, gumbos, and chowders. Africans were also known as expert hunters. So there was rabbit, squirrel, deer, raccoon, opossum, and turtle that filled these larders. It's interesting to note that terrapin, or turtle soup, traditionally prepared by African cooks, became a must-have delicacy at dinners and other special culinary functions in the 18th, 19th, and part of the 20th century America. And the research in this area has shown that this dish was usually a specialty of African cooks and caterers whose recipes dinner hosts did not want to do without. Spices and sauces were made to enhance bland tasting foods. African cooks were sometimes judged by their skill in using spices to make sauces. Peppers, such as malagueta or guinea pepper or grains of paradise, were used fresh, dried, and grated or pounded into a paste and added to those sauces, stews, and soups, or used to baste meats. There was also I pronounce it pili pili, used to season sauces in the Congo, and in Loango seaport of the Congo, cooks preferred pimento pepper. Pimento peppers, pickled in vinegar or lime juice, were also used for medicines. Africans considered it an excellent antidote for upset stomachs. Medicines are another use for many spices in Africa. African spice larder included, but was not limited to, curry, ginger, saffron, thyme, sage, sweet basil, mint, parsley, and other herbs to flavor meats, stews, and sauces. And of course, onions and tomatoes were essential in many dishes. And seeds, nuts, and oils were important seasoning ingredients as well. Melon, cucumber, coriander, sesame seeds, hazelnuts, peanuts, and pistachios flavored stews and sauces. Peanut oil, sometimes sesame seed oil, oil from the kola nut, coconut oil, and especially palm oil were other flavor enhancers. And cooks also used all edible parts of plants, leaves, stems, seeds, and roots, which gave substance and variety to dishes.
I wonder if we could go a little bit deeper. So you mentioned how Africans brought different agricultural techniques and a great familiarity with spices with them to North America. Marjorie would like to know, What other food traditions and foodways Africans brought to North America and that are still with us today?
That is something that we always like to talk about because those traditions we see in many parts of America. For instance, in Louisiana, we have things like gumbo and jambalaya. The Cajuns did not bring those items, those are African originated. And even the beignet, which is just a fritter, Africans made fritters all the time in many parts of the continent. The gulas in Georgia, South Carolina, and some are in Florida, North Carolina, they have many red rice dishes that they brought. Benny soup is a favorite in South Carolina. I want to say that the Carolina Low Country showcased cultural dominance of the Bakongo peoples of Congo, Angola origin, followed by Senegambians and those from the Windward Coast. It was the Bakongo influence that served as an incubator for many Gula cultural patterns. Their traditional rice cultivation and cuisine survived the Middle Passage very definitely. Gullah lifestyle showcased farm-to-table cuisine. Gullah traditional dishes such as red rice, okra soup, and there are many varieties as there are Louisiana gumbo on that, which are almost always prepared with a tomato base, pilau or purloo, hopping john, which Carolina peas and rice, one-pot meals, and numerous shrimp and seafood entrees are always accompanied by or mixed with rice. Leafy greens, spicy hot pepper sauces, peanut and peanut butter stews. Meats were preserved by salting, corning, and sun-drying in Africa, and I think this method was no doubt the precursor to the development of Virginia's Smithfield ham. Favorite methods of preparing fish were pickled, raw, fried, boiled, and what we have come to call gumboing. Dried shrimp and crayfish are still must-have ingredients in stews and sauces, some of which combine different types of fish with coconut milk and other ingredients. Crab, lobster, cod, mackerel, sole, alligator, pike, prawn, gilthead, eel, shrimp, sprat, flounder, carp, and many other varieties of catch were obtained from oceans, rivers, streams, and lagoons, and always provided the fisher folk, such as the Twi of Ghana and the Muslim Bozo, who depended heavily on fishing and boat trade on the Niger and Bani rivers with enormous quantities of fish that were dried and salted or smoked to keep it for long periods of time for sale at markets located well into the interior of the continent. And then to put some of the methods in context, greens simmered with oil, peppers, seasonings, or added to soups, eggplant baked, boiled or fried, boiled fresh beans, and then fruits and vegetables. The beans, fruits, and vegetables could be pounded to a paste, and the paste then used to thicken soups or sauces. Roasted yams and their skins are enjoyed, and yams pounded until they have the consistency of dumpling dough. The dumpling dough is now what they would call fufu when it's in that form, and served with soup or sauce. And fufu was sometimes cooked with meat or poultry. And then as for breads, cassava dough was baked in banana leaves, cassava dough slices deep fried. We still have most of these methods of food preparation. We don't use banana leaves here so much, but we do fry dough to make fritters. And so I'm always amazed when people say French beignets. Well, the thing of it is, when it comes to French and that tag being placed on food, you have to understand that the French name everything in French. Once it has the French name on it, it automatically becomes French. That's just the way it is. It doesn't make it French because it has the French name. It's given a French name, and people just accept it as French.
Yeah, people and cultures definitely tend to use language as a form of cultural assimilation and colonization. So it doesn't surprise me to hear the French did this with French beignets or anything they labeled French. The English certainly did this, and we can see that and a lot of different place names all throughout North America. Now, we've talked a lot about the general trends Africans brought with them to North America during their forced migration. But in her book, At the Table of Power, Diane also includes a lot of different stories about many African and African Americans who made a real difference, not just in the founding of the United States, but also in the new nation's quest for liberty and equality. And they made these contributions all through their cooking, or from the money that they earned from their cooking. So Diane, would you take us back to the American Revolution and tell us about Hannah and Isaac Till and their efforts to keep the Continental Army fed during the Winter of Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778?
Hannah Till was born in Delaware in 1721 or 1722. Her original name was Long Point, a name given to her by her father. Her mother was enslaved. Hannah was owned by John Brinkley, then Parson Henderson, then finally sold to Reverend Mason. Hannah became known as Hannah Archer and Hannah Mason after her enslaver, Reverend John Mason of the Associate Reformed Church in New York, legally owned her by 1776. Reverend Mason leased Hannah to cook for George Washington and his wartime staff. She joined her husband, Isaac Till, also an enslaved cook leased by Captain John Johnson of Bergen County, New Jersey. By the time they were both working for General Washington, Hannah and Isaac already had a daughter named Sarah. At Valley Forge, while living and working in the kitchen of the Isaac Potts House, known today as Washington's headquarters, they had another child, Isaac Worley Till. Both cooks had arranged with Washington and their respective enslavers that they would purchase their freedom. Now, Hannah reached the required sum on October 30th, 1778. She was said to be highly prized as a pastry cook, and now as a salaried one as well. Mrs. Till continued working as Washington's personal cook for 6.5 years, but the last 6 months of her tenure with Washington, she worked for Major General Marquis de Lafayette. After the war, Hannah and Isaac Till found employment cooking for families in Philadelphia. Washington had a dining tent during the war where he hosted his war councils and held formal meals. It was oval, about 28 feet long by 16 feet wide and 12 feet tall, and it is said likely among the largest tents used by the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. One of the meals with Washington was in the summer of 1781 and was described by a French officer. Said the table was spread abundantly with vegetables, roast beef, lamb, chickens, salad dressed with vinegar, green peas, puddings, and some pie, a kind of tart, and Madeira wine. Another meal in 1779, he had beefsteak pie, dishes of crab, and apple pie. Now, these were meals that Washington enjoyed on occasion. Cooking conditions were extremely difficult. There were limited rations, poor quality food. So the meals were unappetizing, especially during periods of supply shortages that occurred at Valley Forge. I gather there were numerous supply shortages. Soldiers were usually given small portions of salted meat, hard biscuits made from flour, and limited vegetables, which were often spoiled due to poor storage and transportation. Their rations were a pound of beef, 3/4 pound of chicken or pork, a pound of flour, 3 pints of peas or beans, and 1 pint of milk, 1 quart of spruce beer cider, and occasionally molasses. But they very seldom saw these rations because of the supply shortages. So soldiers also made fire cakes, which were hard, chewy, tasteless biscuits or crackers made of flour, water, and if available, a little salt. They were baked on rocks in the fire or in ashes. The production of fire cakes sounds slightly similar to the original African American hoe cakes, which George Washington was very fond of. However, for him, they were produced as pancakes. Cooking was subject to long preparation times because firewood and water had to be gathered before anyone could start cooking. And most of the cooking was done in large communal pots over open campfires, with the necessity to improvise cooking utensils, whatever materials were available. Makeshift cooking tools like iron barrel hoops or broken spades were used to cook food. And boiling was the primary cooking method due to its simplicity and ability to rehydrate dried or salted foods.
Another African American who worked really hard to further the revolutionary cause was a tavern keeper named Samuel Francis. Diane, would you tell us about the New York-based Francis and his work on behalf of the revolutionary cause?
New York received its small share of free Black immigrants from the Caribbean, and Samuel Francis was one such immigrant who was considered to be a cook and caterer of talent, if not genius. He was a dark-complexioned mulatto, popularly known as Black Sam. Francis bought the building on the southeast corner of Pearl and Broad Streets on January 15th, 1762, for £2,000. And after a while, what had been called the Queen's Head Tavern, which was named after Queen Charlotte, the young wife of George III of England, was changed to Francis Tavern, and it became the social center of the city. Francis Tavern was a restaurant opened as an inn by the 40-year-old caterer, and it was at Francis Tavern that the New York Chamber of Commerce was organized in 1768. Meetings of the Chamber of Commerce were held in the tavern's long room, and its patrons were the most famous men of the time, making it the scene of many notable gatherings of historical and patriotic significance. Francis Tavern hosted the Committee of Correspondence. Black Sam's cookery was referred to as the starting point and the sustaining pabulum of American liberty. He was said to be the sworn revolutionary, and it was at Francis that the Sons of Liberty and the Vigilance Committee met in 1774 to protest the landing of British tea and to lay plans for a tea party, much like the one that took place in Boston. And it has been suggested that Francis's friendship to the cause of the revolution took the form of spy for the Patriots, who sent secret intelligence under an alias. In addition, Francis was well known to cook for and feed, at his own expense, patriot troops who would stop by his tavern. Francis was known for his palate-pleasing dishes. George Washington frequently dined at Francis, and he was already lodging there from November 26th to December 4th in 1783, and it was on November 30th that Washington gave a party, or as it was referred to at the time, an entertainment. And on December 4th, 1783, about 44 of whom America considers the greatest military leaders were present at Francis's for a farewell dinner. Samuel Francis was asked by Governor Clinton to organize the first public dinner for Washington following the Victory March in New York. Francis was well liked and respected by the most prominent New York citizens of his day. In April 1785, Francis and his wife Elizabeth sold the tavern. When Washington became president, he appointed Francis as his house steward and superintendent of the kitchen of what was then the White House on Cherry Street in New York. Francis continued to work for the Washingtons until June of 1794. Always meticulously dressed, he was a man of taste and a connoisseur of wines. Francis opened a restaurant in Philadelphia, more elegant, they say, than his tavern in New York. The next year, however, he moved his establishment to South Water Street, naming it the Golden Tun Tavern. Washington and other dignitaries dined there, which in turn attracted foreign diplomats, merchants, and sea captains. Francis died a few months after the opening of his new restaurant in 1795.
Now, speaking of George Washington placing a high value on his personal chefs and cooks, Thomas Jefferson did the same thing. He also placed a high value on his personal chefs. Now, before we dive into the stories of Washington's personal chef Hercules and Jefferson's personal chef James Hemings, let's take a moment for our episode sponsor. Diane, would you tell us about George Washington's other personal chef Hercules and Thomas Jefferson's chef James Hemings? Why did Washington and Jefferson place such high values on the culinary talents of Hercules and Hemings?
With George Washington, I can tell you that he did not like the cooking at one of his presidential residences. So in the latter part of 1790, about November, he brought Hercules to his Philadelphia residence on a permanent basis. George Washington Parke Custis, that was Martha Washington's grandson, spoke of Hercules as a culinary celebrated artiste who was, at the period of Washington's presidency, in Custis's words, as highly accomplished and proficient in the culinary arts as could be found in the United States. Hercules was chief chef, and he managed Washington's kitchen, it was said, with iron discipline. He not only had blacks, but also at one point whites under him, one German and two French cooks. Hercules was responsible for the superior level of cuisine and hospitality afforded not only George and Martha, but visitors to the Washington's homes as well. Hercules, his stellar performances, gave the Washington's dinner table renown in political circles and were responsible for one of the first examples of culinary diplomacy. Now, James Hemings as well was a prized possession of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson relished the reputation Hemings and his other Black cooks were building for him as a purveyor of fine dining. So he didn't mind eating well. And of course, in his line of work, culinary diplomacy was a must also. Jefferson decided James would teach James's brother, Peter, everything he knew about cooking. For both Washington and Jefferson, Philadelphia, where both presidents held residences, was considered a bad neighborhood for slaveholders. There was the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1780. It was passed by the Pennsylvania Congress, and it stated that all slaves born after March 1st, 1780 were free at age 28, and any unregistered slave would become free. But another part of this act that affected the two slave-owning presidents states that slaves brought into the state would automatically be free if held there longer than 6 months. It was in 1790 that George Washington was alerted to this problem. Now, George Washington was not about to give up any of his slaves. Washington decides that in order to keep his favorite foods on the table, he, the chief officer of the realm, must scheme to circumvent the law. So in order to accomplish this, Washington had his secretary, Tobias Lear, send his bondspeople out of the city on some phony pretense as the 6-month timeline drew near. He sent Secretary Lear an urgent letter from Richmond, Virginia, while he was on a presidential tour of the South, in which he tells Lear that he's sending Chef Hercules and the others back to Virginia. And Washington actually states that the idea is to deceive both them and the public, and to make Hercules think he is just being asked to come home to cook. Washington's efforts to beat the system that existed in Philadelphia is interesting on all counts, because when the Potomac area became home to the nation's capital, over 1/5 of the area's population was enslaved, many of whom were undoubtedly the property of public officials. Clearly, if the seat of government was located in a part of the country unfriendly to slavery, slaveholders' problems would be compounded. So, in order to guarantee uninterrupted culinary bliss, the capital of the United States had to be purposefully situated in the South, in slave-holding territory, because the president who drew up the plans for the site of the Capitol, as well as most of the people he knew, were slaveholders, and that being the case, he was not about to give up or cause others to give up those big fluffy biscuits and luscious cakes and pies In keeping with Samuel Francis' cookery as being described as the sustaining pablum of American liberty, it was African folks' cooking that determined the location of the capital of the United States.
As we're on the topics of cooking and slavery, Stessa would like to know what role African American cooks and chefs played in the anti-slavery movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and even during the later abolition movement during the mid-19th century. So I think this would be a good place for us to talk about the story of John Remond, Nancy Lennox's wife, and their family, and all of the work that their cooking allowed them to do for the anti-slavery movement. So would you tell us about the Remonds?
I defined those culinary artists who work on behalf of their enslaved sisters and brothers as culinary activists. They were actually working on behalf of all Africans, and many of them were involved directly or indirectly in the Underground Railroad. Sometimes their homes or businesses were local headquarters. A few even hired enslaved runaways to work at their places of business. Others collected money, clothing, and food for a specific drop-off place connected with the Underground Railroad, and those places were sometimes an eating establishment. A few were conductors themselves who managed somehow to transport runaways by boat or steamer. Speaking out against the system of slavery was common, and some wrote anti-slavery columns for anti-slavery newspapers. There were male and female orators who went on the road and spoke at anti-slavery meetings, rallies, and conventions, like Frederick Douglass, Sarah Parker Remond, and her brother Charles L. Remond. Sarah and Charles were from Salem, Massachusetts. In 1790, Salem was the sixth largest city in the U.S., with a little under 8,000 inhabitants. Salem merchants contributed to its mixed population since their ships visited the shores of Arabia, China, India, Africa, and other countries. The ships returned carrying many foreigners. One such ship, the Six Brothers, had been captured by the French but was subsequently released on January 25, 1798, and soon made its homeward journey to Salem. Now, there was an African lad, 10 years old. He managed to get on board this ship without being noticed, but he disembarked at Salem. John Needham, the owner and commander of the ship, placed John Remond under the care of Needham's brother Isaac, who owned a bakery. Young Remond delivered the bakery's bread to private homes as well as to ships. But sometime after his arrival in Salem, John Remond left for Boston to learn the barbering and hairdressing trade, an occupation held by many Blacks during the early decades of the 19th century. Now, during his stay, he garnered a great deal of knowledge with regard to the catering business after meeting Nancy Lennox, his future wife. Miss Lennox was a free woman. She was born in Newton, Massachusetts, and was known as an excellent and talented cook. Remond returned to Salem in 1805. At the age of 19, he opened barber, hairdresser, and catering businesses. Between 1805 and 1857, John Remond occupied the position of the principal restaurateur in Salem. He was referred to as the colored restaurateur. Remond married Nancy Lennox in Boston on October 29, 1807. She was a well-known fancy cake maker, and her skills would prove to be a crucial asset in helping to make her and her husband's catering business successful. And successful it was. The Remonds' cooking and catering were famed and highly valued. Soup was served at his store at 11 a.m. every morning. It was reported that the kitchen had huge brick ovens and a fireplace, which John Remond kept busy by preparing all sorts of fowls, pies, and cakes. Some of the catering that they did were spectacular. One was for the governor of Massachusetts. They catered for the Salem Light Infantry Company. There was a public dinner in honor of Captain Isaac Hull. Then there was Salem's anniversary celebration, a dinner honoring Justice Story, a reception and dinner for the Marquis de Lafayette, and then the dinner for President Andrew Jackson, which was quite an affair. The U.S. Census for 1850 has John Remond's assets listed at $3,600. the 1870 census, his real estate holdings totaled $19,400 and personal assets at $2,000. Parents of 8 children, John and Nancy did not go out on the road physically campaigning in the anti-slavery movement as some Africans did, but they took as many opportunities as possible to demonstrate anti-slavery sentiments. John was said to be a life member of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Nancy and daughters Caroline, Susan, and Sarah participated in the activities of the first Women's Anti-Slavery Society in the U.S., the Female Anti-Slavery Society of Salem, organized in February 1832 by a group of females of color. It is said that their group later became racially mixed. The Remans never utilized products of slave labor for personal use. When they could not get free labor, sugar, molasses, or rice, they used substitute or went without. 2 of their children played crucial roles in the anti-slavery cause, making their names synonymous with abolition. Others built extensive businesses and were very important contributors to that world. The children had all been exposed to art, music, books, anti-slavery literature of all sorts, including The Liberator, and newspapers published by free blacks such as Freedom's Journal, The North Star, The Colored American, and others, which were conspicuously displayed in their shops. Contributing in many ways to the abolitionist movement, the Remans were always a stop for anti-slavery lecturers, and their home received a number of fugitive slaves who were provided with nourishment, clothing, and shelter. Such a background of family, racial, and social consciousness instilled the driving force for the anti-slavery activities of their 2 most famous children, Charles Lennox Remond, hailed as the first and most eloquent Black abolitionist lecturer before the appearance of Frederick Douglass, and Sarah Parker Remond, lecturing agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society.
We've just had a wide-ranging discussion of all the different flavors and cooking techniques that Africans brought with them to North America, and the many different ways that African Americans used their cooking to contribute to American independence and the forming of the new nation. Diane, you make the case in your book, At the Table of Power, that there has been a movement to erase these African and African American contributions to United States history. And I wonder if you would tell us about this erasure movement and why your work is so necessary.
Yes, and it has to do with the American culinary master narrative. It's what I call culinary apartheid, theft and erasure of African American culinary achievements, and the assigning of those achievements to others. It is another expression of racism that upholds the law of white supremacy by means of slavery jurisprudence, laws created and enforced, and court decisions handed down during the era of slavery. Now, slavery jurisprudence legitimizes culinary apartheid and upholds now, as it did during slavery, the interrelationship between the American judicial system and institutionalized racism. Culinary apartheid applies to the African cook in American culinary history. Now, many of us are aware that numerous cookbooks were compiled and published by Southern white women after the end of the Civil War. The recipes in these cookbooks were hailed as the creations of the white women who had them published. The recipes actually were the creations of the African women and men who served them. And they were the creations which the white women wrote down and had published in their own names as authors. Now, some of these books contained a rare reference to a Black cook, and they were easy to spot. These cooks were always called by their first names, or the first name was preceded by the term aunt, uncle, or mammy. And the identities of the actual enslaved Africans who created these recipes and all references to them were in this way erased from history. And this was certainly the means to an end, because the end of the Civil War fostered the attempt to forge white Southern nationalism. And in this case, it centered around food. Africans were to play no part in this nationalism, so that in promoting Southern white culture, the concept of Southern cooking started out as whites-only cuisine with an imperialist mindset steeped in colonialist values. Whites have taken recipes and cooking methods of African American creation and creativity, claimed the recipes and the creativity, renamed them, and bulldozed the names of and reference to the originators into oblivion. So, with regard to what African American chefs, cooks, and caterers produce, as far as I'm concerned, slavery has never ended. There has always been an unwritten law that allowed theft with impunity of African American culture, and music and cooking and cuisine have always been among those aspects of African American culture most vulnerable to theft. And it was never necessary to announce out loud the intent or the common understanding that it was all right to take whatever those who control wanted.
Diane, what is one thing that you wish more Americans understood about African and African American culinary history and the contributions that African and African American cooks, bakers, and chefs have made to United States history?
I would say the foundation of America's national cuisine was formulated in the pots and cauldrons of America's Southern Black cooks. Africans dominated American kitchens from the 1600s on and stood at the helm as creative head chefs of farms and plantations, restaurants, hotels, steamboats, lodges, and private clubs, trains, and private homes of the elites. And when I say dominated, I mean that whites stood back on this occasion and offered only one contribution: their appetites. However, the African contribution has been bulldozed in many cases, pushed to the periphery of, and is a mere footnote in American culinary history. Now, part of the process of making Africans and their descendants invisible in culinary history is having their creations and contributions to culture and politics largely ignored. Everything that they created is credited to Europeans and to just about everybody else. The truth is, African cultural retention and continuity can be observed in and permeate not only African American culture, but white America's as well, by virtue of the Black hand in virtually every aspect of American culture. Africanisms are present in many aspects of life of the white population of this country, particularly in American music, speech, manners, religious expression, and without any doubt, cooking and cuisine. Now, there are local differences in cooking traditions, but it needs to be understood that the cuisine of, say, Richmond, Virginia, is no more an adaptation of that of England than the dishes served in New Orleans are those of France.
It's time for our segment, 1776 in Context. As we're in the thick of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, Diane, how do you think your research into the contributions and culinary accomplishments of Black chefs, cooks, and bakers can help us better understand the American Revolution?
Well, there would not have been an American Revolution without the contributions of Black chefs, cooks, and bakers. In the 1930s, kind of reiterate that notation. The person was Frederick Haskin, who wrote about the place of cooks in history being overlooked and underestimated. And you can say that again with regard to their contribution to that revolution. I mean, Hannah Till and her husband Isaac, personal chef to Washington, preparing meals for him and his troops during that grueling winter at Valley Forge. She cooked for Marquis de Lafayette. Cyrus Boustil, a baker, supplied the Patriot troops. He sold biscuits, cakes, and breads for many years on credit and profit. And after the outbreak of the American Revolution, Boustil was the supplier for the American forces for his area. And of course, Samuel Francis, who fed Washington and his troops, sometimes for free. Cuffy Cockroach, said to be the first caterer of Newport, Rhode Island. Also Charity Duchess Quimino, the pastry and baked goods queen of Rhode Island. During the occupation of Newport by foreign troops, Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau praised her cuisine. She cooked for him and his troops. And of course, there were many other Africans who fed the Revolutionary Army. And a couple of those names the public might have heard before, but many more are never mentioned in a way that the public would be familiar with them. So this is why it's important to reconstruct the true culinary history of African America. When I think about researching the area of African American culinary history that warrant attention to its culinary contributions and accomplishments, I am reminded of Judge A. Leon Higginbotham's precepts on African American slavery jurisprudence as they apply to culinary apartheid. Part of the precept he notes, called powerlessness, tells us that without knowledge of your own culture, culinary and otherwise, you are powerless and are bound to remain in and accept the false master narrative.
Diane, you've written many articles and 2 books about culinary history. Is there another research project that you're working on now?
There is. I've actually just completed a 3rd book. Once you go Black, you never go back. The national and international impact of African American cuisine in the 19th and 20th centuries. It should be out in a few weeks. And this particular book, it explores the national and international impact of African American cuisine in the 19th and 20th centuries. It looks at the businesses that African Americans were able to open and develop despite the demise of Reconstruction and the ensuing laws put into effect to curtail any type of self-help that Black Americans were trying to establish. It showcases a number of caterers and restaurateurs and hotel owners and others in food service who became successful, not only here, but also in Europe, specifically France. So it was an interesting project as well.
Now, if we have more questions about African and African American culinary history in the United States, or if we want to follow your work more closely, where is the best place for us to get in contact with you?
Email address is Diane_ and then the last name Spivey at Comcast.net.
Diane Spivey, thank you for helping us better understand the culinary history of the United States through African and African American cooking and foodways.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate that very much.
African and African American cooking has had a significant impact on the history of North America and the founding of the United States. Although enslaved, Africans had a lot to offer European colonists, not only through their labor, but also through their knowledge and intelligence. Through their extensive knowledge of crops, farming techniques, and spices, enslaved Africans kept European colonists fed. Colonists not only consumed rice, seafood, turtles, and other nutritious foods, they consumed them in African ways, through gumbo, turtle soup, and rice and bean dishes. Then, African American cooks, bakers, and chefs prepared the dishes that kept the Continental Army going. We heard about Hannah and Isaac Till, who kept George Washington and his officers fed at Valley Forge, how the bakers in Rhode Island supplied bread for troops, and how some other chefs prepared dishes for the United States' French allies. Plus, Samuel Francis was not only said to keep American prisoners of war fed, he may have also been a spy for the revolutionaries. And then, of course, there's the example of the Ramond family of Salem, Massachusetts. The Ramonds used their cooking to better their economic station, and with that money, they educated their children and helped where they could to support the anti-slavery and abolition movements. Now, although cooking has historically been looked down upon as menial labor, the work of Blacks and women, African American men and women created opportunities to support causes that they believed in through their cooking and culinary prowess. Causes like the founding of the United States and working to keep it true to its founding principles of liberty and equality. Look for more information about Diane, her book, At the Table of Power, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/404. Like a good meal, podcasts are best served and shared with friends. So please share Ben Franklin's World with your friends and family. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, You've been asking for more episodes about food history. So what other food histories or culinary experiences would you like to explore? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.